Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to have a little introduction to exactly what applied behavioral analysis is. So what is ABA? ABA is, at its core, the science of studying, controlling, and predicting behavior. But what most people do with ABA is examine behaviors and then use that information to try to modify behaviors, to try and change behaviors in a way that either helps them out or helps the other person out. And with ABA, the focus is on observations. How do we watch people behave in certain ways? We kind of examine how behaviors relate to other people, relate to different situations, and use that information to try and change behaviors. ABA was born from a lot of behavioral psychologists, such as Pavlov's classical conditioning, such as Thorndike's law of effect, which basically says people are going to repeat behaviors that are followed by good things and try to avoid behaviors that are followed by bad things. A lot of the research by John Watson and his kind of behaviorism movement, and also followed by his colleague, B.F. Skinner, kind of solidifying exactly what operant conditioning is. So, if we're following in the footsteps of these behaviorists, it's important to figure out exactly what a behavior is. And in its kind of most basic form, a behavior is what people do, any action a person can take. It has different characteristics, such as intensity, duration. Behaviors can be observed, they can be described, they can be recorded. Most of the time they are overt, so it's kind of obvious that a person is behaving, but sometimes they are more covert, they are kind of hidden. We'll talk a little bit about some more covert behaviors in just a second. Behaviors directly impact their environment, so they influence other people, they influence the situation around them, and behavior is lawful. One of the kind of simplest tests to use to figure out, all right, is this a behavior or not, is known as the dead man test. If a dead man can do it, it probably isn't a behavior. But if a dead man can't do it, it probably is a behavior. So, for example, a dead man can't walk, walking is a behavior. Dead man can't eat, eating is a behavior. Dancing, playing poker, babbling, learning the alphabet. Any number of things that a dead man cannot do is likely a behavior. Lying on the ground, not reacting, those kinds of things, those are not behaviors. But what about thinking? This is kind of a gray area in which we talked about the difference between overt and covert behaviors. Thinking is definitely a covert behavior, especially when we think about maybe subvocal speech, talking in our heads. We could argue that those are behaviors, but we cannot directly observe them. So for that reason, ABA does not really consider those to be behaviors, at least not until we can study them empirically and observe them. So for the purposes of ABA currently using our current technology and methodologies, thinking is not a behavior. So if we're talking about trying to modify behavior, we can't change the way a person thinks because we can't observe the way a person thinks. So let's take a step back and look at ABA and the goals of ABA. How do we use ABA techniques, ABA thought processes to examine and modify behaviors? Well, the two main components of ABA are exactly that: analysis, kind of identifying a relationship between a behavior and the person and the environment, and then trying to modify that behavior, trying to develop procedures that can help us change the behavior in some way for the better. That could be eliminating a behavior, or that could be introducing a new, more appropriate behavior instead of this other behavior that we may want to get rid of. And for each behavior, there are three primary components that we want to focus on. And these are also referenced as the ABCs of behavior. We have the antecedent, the behavior itself, and then the consequence. The antecedent is anything in the environment that cues a specific behavior. So for example, I am really bad about grinding my teeth. So an antecedent of grinding my teeth would be stress. If I'm really stressed out, I might be more likely to grind my teeth. Or maybe if I've just eaten or chewed gum lately, I might be more likely to grind my teeth because of that. So those are examples of antecedents, some kind of cue in the environment that is going to make the behavior more likely to occur. Then we have B, behavior. That's the behavior itself. This is the action or the behavior that is prompted by that antecedent. And then we have the consequence. This is a little bit confusing because when we might initially think of consequences, we might think of kind of the outcome of a behavior. But it's kind of better to think of the consequence as something that follows the behavior that makes the behavior either more or less likely to occur. So grinding my teeth might relieve some of that stress that I'm feeling. So a consequence of this behavior is stress relief. Another example of a behavior that we might want to reinforce, say, if we're playing basketball, shooting free throws, my behavior that I want to increase might be using the correct form to shoot a free throw. A consequence of that might be me making more free throws. So the consequence is actually helping the behavior become more likely. So the consequence of the ball going into the hoop is going to increase the likelihood of me trying to really focus on using correct form. If I use this form and the ball doesn't go in, that's actually going to decrease the likelihood of me using that form. So you can see how consequence is not necessarily just the outcome of a behavior, but it's how it influences the likelihood of the behavior occurring in the future. So that's something important to consider. So we've talked about behaviors. One important thing to make sure I talk about is distinguishing between target behaviors and other behaviors. The target behavior is always the behavior that we want to modify. This is the behavior of interest. This is the behavior that we want to either increase or decrease, or maybe extinguish completely. We'll talk about other behaviors that we might use to influence the target behavior, but the target behavior is always the behavior that we want to change in some way. So make sure when we start talking about many different behaviors that the target behavior is the one that we actually want to change. Another important thing to consider is what's known as a contingency. This is basically another way of describing a causal relationship. And this is oftentimes focused on the relationship between a behavior and a consequence or an outcome. So if I use this specific behavior, if I grind my teeth, that's going to cause me to not be as stressed. Or if I use correct form on my basketball free throw, that's going to cause the ball to go in more. We want to focus on these contingencies, on these causal relationships that allow us to increase the behaviors that we want to increase and decrease the behaviors that we want to decrease. So let's use another example. So I'm a big Oklahoma City Thunder fan. Let's say that every time the Thunder lose, I go out and get a double Western bacon cheeseburger from Carl's Jr. Every time I eat one of these burgers, I'm going to become more and more obese as a result. And that's going to presumably be a consequence that should deter me from eating these burgers. But there is a contingency there. The more burgers I eat, the fatter I'm going to get. You could also argue that there is a contingency between the Thunder losing and me eating a burger, especially if it's the case where every time the Thunder lose, I eat a double Western bacon cheeseburger. So focusing on where these contingencies are and then trying to do something about these contingencies, especially in this example because this is not a good contingency, I do not want to continue to do this, is one of the key kind of skills that you should develop through ABA. So in identifying some of these contingencies, what we end up doing is identifying environmental variables that we can modify in some way. Shifting or modifying how we interact with people, how we interact with our immediate environments, the specific situations that we put ourselves in. How do these lead to the specific behaviors that we want to either increase or decrease? And one nice thing about this is that anyone can use this. Yes, ABA is used by a lot of professionals to modify behaviors, but anyone can use these principles in their own daily lives. We can use self-management, which we'll talk about later on in the course, to exercise more or eat healthier. Parents can use these to help their children behave in more appropriate ways. Teachers can use these to help children learn new material, etc., etc. So there are a lot of great applications for these techniques. There are a couple of other important points I want to point out about ABA as well. First of all, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. We'll talk about that later on in the quarter. But it's an important distinction to make that when we talk about reinforcers, so things that increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring, we're not talking about bribes and we're not talking about rewards. Bribes are different from reinforcers because bribes occur before a behavior has actually happened. So you kind of get the positive outcome before you even perform the behavior. And rewards are different because rewards are focusing on the person and not the behavior. And this is an important distinction to make because when we talk about a lot of these strategies and interventions that we can use to change behaviors, all of them are focused on modifying the behavior. They're not focused on modifying the person who performs this behavior. It's an important distinction, and we'll talk about that as we go along in the quarter. But bribes, again, occur before the behavior has actually happened, and rewards are focused more on the person rather than the behavior. With ABA, we're focusing primarily on the behavior. So the last thing I want to talk about is who uses applied behavioral analysis. Well, as I've kind of hinted at, a lot of people do. People can use these in everyday situations, and there are a lot of careers that use these techniques to help them get through their day-to-day tasks, such as physical therapists, such as social workers, such as teachers, such as early child educators, such as nurses. All of these different career paths use these skills and these techniques to help encourage specific behaviors and to help eliminate unwanted behaviors. And finally, I think a very important point is that ABA is different from a lot of more experimental psychological practices in that ABA is tailored to the individual. Every person is a separate case. It's very difficult to kind of broadly apply these techniques to every person because every person behaves in different ways, is motivated by different things. So sometimes you have to try many different techniques to make sure that you can make the change occur. But the thing is, it's not about figuring out whether or not a specific technique is good or bad. It's about changing the behavior in the individual. So the goal is to make this work. It's not to examine whether or not these techniques are effective. It's to actually change behaviors. Sometimes people don't actually need to be aware that many of these techniques are being used. Sometimes it's actually more effective if they're not aware that these things are occurring. And additionally, kind of the best techniques are the simplest techniques, the ones that don't force people to jump through a lot of hoops. We'll talk about reinforcement in the coming weeks, but reinforcement is kind of the best technique to use, the simplest technique to use. And if you can use that, then that's great. That's what you want to try and do. Then if this doesn't work, you need to move to what some would consider more complicated techniques to try and see if those can work. So that's all I have in terms of an introduction to the course. Hopefully this gives you a good general idea of what to expect over the next few months. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks.